Troy. Good to see you again, my friend. Happy New Year and welcome to the podcast.
Happy New Year, Layton. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience and give them some background on how you ended up where you are at this point in time.
Sure, yeah. So my name is Troy Hinke. I own Living Roots Compost Tea. I've had Living Roots Compost Tea since 2017, but I've been doing this for about 12, it's going on 13 years now. So I ended up getting into soil biology. I went back to school in 2010 at Maharishi University of Management in Fairfield, Iowa. It's changed names now. Again, I can't remember. I think it's Maharishi International University or something. But so Dr. Elaine Ingham used to teach at Maharishi every May in the spring, and they have a block system where you do one class at a time. So she would come for the month of May. And so 2011, I had taken a class with her, 28-day intensive class in person, and just had an aha moment where I knew that's exactly what I wanted to do and what I wanted to follow. So kind of gave up school. I asked Elaine when I could go, how I could apprentice with her specifically. That year is the year that she had just become the chief research scientist at Rodale Institute in Kutztown, Pennsylvania. So she was going to be at Rodale for the month of July. Otherwise, she was going to be away doing her own talking events and things like that. So I came for the month of July and apprenticed. And through that, the people at Rodale really liked me and liked my work ethic and wanted to bring me on to work alongside Elaine. So they got a grant for me, a compost grant. And that fall, I came on at Rodale to be the compost research specialist, working alongside Elaine, doing compost and compost tea or extract research on large and small scale. So we were doing food scrap or food waste composting on site there and doing experiments with that, and then doing field applications of both compost and compost extract and looking at results. So from there, I helped Elaine teach classes, and from there, I went out and just started kind of teaching, giving presentations here and there, and then doing microscope analysis here and there. And I had been doing microscope analysis at Rodale. People were sending in samples. And then my friends in the Nashville area, I've got a couple friends with small businesses, Cliff Davis with Pig and Leaf and Jeremy Lekich with Nashville Foodscapes. Both were like, hey man, you should really get a compost tea business going. So I wanted to get like just kind of a small side thing going. Is my mic going good?
Yeah, you sound perfect, my friend.
Okay, I thought I saw you word something there like there was an issue.
No, I was yelling at the dog.
Okay, just wanted to make sure. Anyway, yeah, so they were like, hey, you should get a business going, and I just had kind of gotten a small side business going to do like lawn landscape garden sprays in the Nashville area. And when people started finding out about my experience, they wanted to consult with me. So it ended up being half compost tea sprays, half consulting. And then a couple years ago, I relocated from Nashville back to the Kutztown area. I actually not too far from Rodale again. And since moving, I'm pretty much just doing consulting with growers or composters, as well as doing microscope analysis. And here and there, I'll do a compost extract or tea spray for someone, but I'm not pushing it or advertising it or anything like that.
Fantastic. I always wondered where you came from when we met at Rodale, and it was Maharishi, because I think there was 7 or 8 of you guys that came for that summer.
Well, I came in the fall to work with Elaine, and then the next summer there was a bunch of interns that signed on from having taken a class with Elaine that wanted to come there. So then there were interns that came the next summer to work on the microscope after I had been there. Yeah.
Yeah. So I remember when I came to Rodale to show Elaine my fish product, and basically I knew that when I poured it on plants, we'd have great plant reaction, but I didn't understand how it worked. And so I came down to meet her, to show it to her, and try to get her to explain what it was and why it worked so well. And I think I met you probably within, I don't know, a month, less of that, when she started explaining to me, well, you need to microscope it to understand what it is you're looking at. And I remember going up into the microscope lab, and I'd bring a vial of my different levels of aeration extract from the fish manure, and I get, some of those interns would look at me like, "What the fuck? That smells like hell."
Yes, I remember.
But I was trying to understand at that point too, like what was the best way to aerobically stabilize it? Like how long, and did I need to do anything other than aeration, and how much aeration? So I was, again, learning to manipulate the material in a way to make it more beneficial. And you were the only one in that group that were basically like, "Oh, Leighton, here, this is a nematode, this is a predatory, this one's a fungal feeder," because the other ones are just like, "Get the fuck away from me."
Yeah.
So that was quite a journey down there. And I always again wondered like how you ended up on that trail. So prior to going to Maharishi the year before, how did you end up like connecting with Elaine?
I just happened to sign up for the class. I don't know if you want me to tell it here, but I had a really serendipitous events that led me to going to Maharishi. I wanted to go back to school for several years, and I just couldn't find anything that like fit the bill for me, and I'm pretty particular. And then it started coming up on Facebook at that time that they had a sustainable living degree, and so it really was grabbing my attention. And then I watched this documentary called A Fistful of Quarters, The King of Kongs, or The King of Kongs, A Fistful of Quarters, about this guy who goes out to break the Donkey Kong record from the 1980s. And in it, there's this guy from near Fairfield, Iowa. I can't think of the name. It starts with a B. Anyway, he keeps the records for gaming, and I think he still does to this day for like Guinness. And so there's this dude in this movie who's like talking about meditating in Maharishi, Fairfield, Iowa. And then I'm seeing this thing on Facebook, and then I meet this dude in person. I like happened to help him out to be like a nice guy and had taken some medicine to his house or something like that. And there's a picture on the wall of Maharishi with the Beatles, and I didn't know who Maharishi was. And I'm like, "Oh, the Beatles." And he's like, "Yeah, do you know who that is?" And so like this guy had just moved from Fairfield to Nashville where I was. And it was this weird tie-in of I met this guy, I watched this movie, and then these ads are coming up, and I'm like, okay, I got to check this place out. So I submitted a whatever you call it for application for school, and got accepted. And then just happened to I wanted to go for organic agriculture, and happened to sign up for Elaine's class, having no idea who she was. And then once I got it, people were like, "Oh man, you got Elaine Ingham's class?" And I'm like, "Yeah, like who is she?" And then had the class, and then found out, who she was, and was impressed, and really, wanted to follow that, obviously.
Oh my God, I had the same exact kind of experience. So I had no idea who Elaine was, like no idea. So this guy, Jeff Frank from Long Island, who I met through another friend, was doing organic land care. He was teaching courses in organic land care for landscape contractors. And when he heard, about what I was doing, he's like, "Oh my God, you gotta go show Elaine. You gotta go show Elaine." And I'm like, "All right, who the fuck is this Elaine?" So finally, I'm like, "All right, I'll go down and meet Elaine." So I go down there, I bring her the vial. She looks at it on the microscope, and it's like, "Oh my God, where did you get this stuff?" And I'm like, "Well, it's fish manure." "Well, how do you capture fish manure? You can't go behind the pooper scooper." And I'm like, "Well, I made this filter to catch it, to pull the turbidity out of the water so I could put the water back into the fish." And that's how it all started. Well, it was about a couple months later that she asked me to stay on a Saturday. I don't know if you were there or not, because she was teaching a microscope class there. Were you part of that when we set up like 30 microscopes?
I can't remember if it was that time with you, because I was actually living on site with Elaine for 6 months of the time that I was there. We lived together on site, and
You might have been away. It was on a Saturday, and she asked me to deliberately stay because usually I was down there Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and I'd beat it Friday afternoon.
Yeah.
But anyway, so she asked me, Leighton, now that you're proficient enough to set up a microscope and assist people in putting slides and the basics, would you stay for this class? And I'm like, Elaine, of course, whatever you need. So I go in Friday night, we start building the microscopes. Then Saturday morning, we're going in and setting them up on tables, getting the extension cords, getting all the supplies for each little station. And all these people started filing in, and they're, all this whispering and talking. Oh my God, it's Elaine. I'm going to get her to sign this book or sign this. And I can't believe I'm actually going to get to meet her. What the fuck? Who is this woman? So, the whole day goes by. I'm helping, running around like a crazy man, trying to keep up with all these people to teach them how to use this microscope they just purchased. And at the end of the day, the crowd dissipates, and it's just Elaine and I kind of cleaning up that conference area at Rodale. And I'm like, so you're someone special. Who are you? And she goes, Leighton, that's what I love about you. You've always treated me just like a regular person. But yeah, I created this thing called the Soil Food Web, and it's kind of a big thing.
That's hilarious.
Oh God! Now you were a part of the Thursday crew, right? We go down to the tavern and have wings and beer.
I went there a few times, but I don't drink, so I didn't go a whole bunch. But I did go there with you guys.
Yeah, we would get into some crazy conversations there, because you give her a couple bourbon stouts and she turns into this crazy wild woman.
Yeah.
Now, were you there during Superstorm Sandy, or had you left by then?
No, I was not there then.
Okay, because that was super crazy. So obviously the audience probably knows nothing about this, but a hurricane came in, and it was more than just a hurricane. It was like 2 or 3 lows all got together and hit the East Coast and blew it up. So there was no power. Everything was shut down. I got trapped there. I should have left like the night before, but I didn't. I was like, I'm from New England. They predict this shit all the time. It never fucking happens, right? So I stay. The next day you get up, it was a disaster. Like power was out. I was lucky. My hotel had electricity. And the house that I think you stayed in too was part of the Rodale power grid when on their generator.
Right.
So she had power, and there was one other person who had stayed. So it was basically the 3 of us trapped for, I think it was 3 or maybe 4 days on the Rodale campus. And we had a lot of antics, to say the least.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was the first night, I think it was. She had fortunately been smart and stocked up on her growlers of her bourbon stout that she loved from the tavern. And
Yes.
Of course, I had a bottle of whiskey or scotch with me, so I was all set. So we sat around and played Uno. And, about halfway into the game, I said, Elaine, this is something that's always bugged me. Like, where do you think life came from on Earth? Do you think it was, like panspermia, or alien came and took a dump on the planet, or do you think it was, the God particle? I mean, what do you believe? And she laughed like a son of a bitch when I said alien taking a dump on the planet. We did work or talk about poop a lot.
That does come up a lot.
Yeah, it does. Whether it's fish, worm, or whatever. So yeah, she said, no, I truly believe it was, a comet that came in, panspermia, and exploded and provided the microbes and the water to allow them to transfer into the soil and create the foundation of the soil food web, after the planet cooled down enough. So that was an interesting time, to say the least. And nothing like getting a good giggle out of her, because once you get her laughing, boy, she was crazy.
Yeah. Yeah.
So obviously you started this journey serendipitously before. Now, did you grow up on a farm, or did your parents garden, or did you have any background prior to that?
No, my dad grew up on a farm. and my family has a background of farming, but he turned into a banker, and I grew up not at all doing anything like that. So yeah, I've never had any experience with anything like this. And that's what's kind of crazy, is that I didn't have a whole lot of experience. And then my first gig was at Rodale being a compost research specialist. So it was very fortuitous. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, and obviously you didn't have a college degree and background in it either.
No, nope. Yeah.
Ironic. So similar experience. I came from cutting stone, well, general contracting, then I subcontracted into stone cutting, and then went through a divorce and a life shift, and ended up freaking at Rodale too. Like, who knew, right? You can't make this shit up.
Yeah.
So there was a interesting study that you did with a gentleman, I forget his name, on DNA work on the extracts.
Oh yeah, Dr. Zach Jones.
Dr. Zach Jones, correct. So let's talk a little bit about that, because I'm a big proponent of diversity. And one of the things, the foundation of my product, obviously, is fish manure or fish poop. But I also always used vermicompost, as well as my own compost that I made wherever I was working at the time. And I noticed something that was really interesting about the work that he did for you, showing incredible diversity across the boards in your vermicompost. So what was your key to that? Because was it the bedding? Was it the food scraps? I mean, how did you get that level?
Yeah, I mean, I just focus on a diversity of feedstocks all the time. So, there's multiple things going into my bin, and I'm always just trying to focus on maintaining an environment that's going to promote more fungi, especially, obviously, but microorganisms in general. So yeah, it's mainly the management style, making sure I have a good amount of foods rather than just have straw and wood chips and one other thing, or just a few feedstocks. Diversity in feedstocks, and then really a good management style.
So do you remember Richard Mitchell?
Yeah. He's not far. We talk.
Oh, do you still see him?
I haven't seen him, but we chatted on the phone.
Oh, nice. I haven't chatted with him in a few months, but talk about another wildcat. He was out of the blue, crash landed there to do vermicomposting at the time.
Yeah.
And I loved his style. His style was to go take bales of hay and create a room at a organic farmer's site. And then he'd build like a volcano bed in the middle with the bedding for his worms. He'd lay the worms in there, and then he'd have the farmer just throw the scraps at the pile, and whatever hit the pile that didn't stick, it rolled down to the base and up against the hay bales. So it had like a kind of like automated feeder, so the worms could be in their bedding, or they could come out and gorge, but they never got stuck in that like kind of anaerobic pocket. Maybe right. You have some other tricks for the audience on how to prevent that, because that's generally, the big bad experience that a lot of people have when they try to vermicompost, that they end up turning the whole thing into anaerobic soup.
Yeah, the number one problem with vermicomposting, with people run into with vermicomposting, is that they're not adding any or not adding enough carbonaceous or brown materials. So they're like, oh, I'm composting my food scraps and I'm turning this into fertility, and they're only really focusing on the food scraps when they really need to be focusing on as an equal amount or more of brown material at the same time. So every time you're putting in 2 cups of food scraps, you should be putting in 2 to 4 cups of brown material, like shredded paper, cardboard, leaf mold, or something like that.
Yeah, thank you. That's always been a big question, is like preparing the bedding properly. And I remember Richard used to get a lot of leaf mold, and he would definitely have at the time the first exposure I had to really fungally dominant worm castings. And so I assume you're doing a similar kind of ratio to get that fungi level up.
Yeah. I use leaves as much as I can, or I'm just trying to use as much brown material as I can. So I'm generally pre-composting material where that can be like a new term, but it's basically putting compost through the thermophilic process or getting it to begin to decompose and then feeding it to worms. So rather than throwing a fresh banana peel on top of my worm bin, I'm getting that banana peel to break down a bit and then feeding it to the worms.
Very cool. That's
Um, what was I going to say? You had asked me a question. I forgot what it was that I was going to answer other than that.
So it was about getting fungally dominant.
Oh, yeah. One thing I have noticed is you would think that so I've compared compost. I've made so much compost in the past however many years and tested it. So I'm always researching. I'm not necessarily keeping track of the results in a digital format or whatever, but it's in my head. And you would think that wood chips or a wood chip dominant pile would, give you tons of fungal foods because you've got those nice wood chips and things like that. So I've kind of compared wood chips to leaves, and leaves are going to be just as much carbon, but you would think that there's going to be more carbon and foods in an actual wood chip or in the tissue of the wood. But I found that I generally get the most fungal dominant compost or more fungi when I'm using a lot of leaves, which makes sense if you think about it, because every year nature is feeding the soil all of this carbon in leaves to feed that fungi in the soil. So it's nature's food source for foods. Nature isn't necessarily chopping up wood and throwing it down. It's putting down leaves every year.
Yeah, that's a great point. Now, do you harvest the leaves after they fall, or do you let them start to break down before you add them to the bin?
It's leaves that have fallen in the autumn that either I've collected or other people have collected that I'll, get and then use as a feedstock.
Nice. Because the reason I ask that is that I've noticed that when you allow the leaves to leave them for a while, so that they're not like just freshly raked up, but they're actually starting to pile up and start to compact and create wet layers and so forth, that you get a explosion of endophytic fungi that come out and convert to saprophytic. And so that has always been my secret sauce to building my compost, is that I will extract leaves that have spent at least 6 months stacked up on themselves, and perhaps obviously over the winter, and then harvest them in the spring. Are you doing a similar practice, or?
Yeah, that good point. So most of the leaves that I've collected are not freshly fallen. They've been in a bag for 3, 6, 9 months. So yeah, they're aging and broken down some. Or I would put them through a shredder.
Got you. So very similar practices.
Yes. Yeah.
So Ken, I don't know if you found that that pie chart that shows the diversity of what Troy accomplished in his vermicompost DNA extract or extraction. But if you can pull it up and then just put it up on the screen when you can, that'd be fantastic. So you talked about a higher browns to greens ratio. Do you have like a percentage that you recommend?
Yeah, I mean, I'm usually always going for about 2/3 brown to 1/3 green.
And is that similar with the food scraps in the pre-digest of the vermicompost bedding?
Yeah. It might even be heavier than that, because like in my kitchen, what happens generally is I'll have a kitchen bucket where it's going in 50-50. So like for every food scrap, it's getting covered with an equal amount of paper or shredded cardboard. And then that gets taken outside and then covered up with some more wood chips or leaves. So you've got the brown green mixture that then gets covered up again with carbon. So it ends up being, it usually should be about 2/3.
Got you. And so it's probably 25% actual high nitrogen food scrap to uh, well, again, 60-30 for your compost mix. For your
No, altogether nitrogen, 30% nitrogen, 33, 66 or whatever.
Yep. Okay. All right, because that's always been another challenge with trying to compost food waste is that a lot of times it gets very anaerobic and nasty very quickly because they are either not pre-digesting it or they're adding too much. They're adding 33% food scrap to 66%, wood chips or browns. I mean, that's kind of the experience I've had out here in California, and there's been a big push to get rid of the food scraps being allowed to go into the landfill. And so a lot of these guys have been trying to do this to compost using food scraps at those ratios, and it's turned into quite a nightmare. All right, can you scroll down a little bit, Ken, on that? Oh, we lost him. It was a really cool pie chart that I wanted to pull up that we can talk a little bit more about. I'm sure he'll pop up when he can.
Looks like it's coming up there. So I can explain what I did here while he's bringing that up.
Yeah, perfect.
I had attended and spoken at the NC State Vermiculture Conference, which is no longer in existence because the lady Rhonda Sherman, who had run it, retired. But there I met Dr. Zach Jones, who's a young PhD who has this Microbiome project. He's doing DNA sequencing. He lives in Colorado. He's doing DNA sequencing specifically on vermicompost. So he's been having people over the past several years, not as much in the past few months, but over the past several years, having like whoever, like, hey, send me your vermicompost just to get it sequenced so that he could have all this data to compare. He had asked me if I'd send in a sample, and what we did was he sent me three of these little vials, and then I can't remember what this liquid is called, but it basically locks the biology in place. So I had a vermicompost sample that I put in the vial, and then I put this liquid in there, and it locks the biology right where it's at right then. So like no addition, no subtraction of any biology. So we did that with vermicompost. And then I took that exact same vermicompost and I used the recipe that I put out through my podcast and things like that and brewed a 5-gallon brew with fish hydrolysate, humic acid, and water at ambient temperature. Brewed that for, I think it was 24 hours for testing purposes. And then I put that in a vial and I locked the biology in place. And then I did a compost extract. So a compost extract, for people who may not know, is where you're making similar to a compost tea. You're putting solid compost in water, but instead of adding foods to try and get those microorganisms to reproduce, you're just putting it in there, extracting microorganisms, and then taking it out and using it. So we had a vermicompost sample, we had a compost tea sample, and then third, we had an extract sample where I just took ambient water, put the same exact amount of vermicast in there as I used for the tea, which I believe was 3 cups per 5 gallons, and then mixed it up by hand for 5 minutes, put that in the vial, locked it into place, and then Zach did DNA sequencing. He found that my vermicompost, he called it the gold standard. It had the most diversity of any that he had seen. And then when he was looking at the extract, so what I was explaining to you all, and if you may not have as much experience, I just want to make sure you're clear on this. The extract is where we're taking water, we're taking compost and putting it into the water, and only for like 5 minutes, maybe aerating it or mixing it by hand, and then taking that and spraying it out on soils or plants. So that's an extract. A compost tea is where you're putting compost in there like that. You're adding little bits of foods for microorganisms, agitating it, aerating it for 12 to 48 hours, and trying to get an explosion of microorganisms. So with the vermicompost, we had, tons of diversity. And then when we made the extract, we've got just the water and the organisms. And so there was great diversity within the extract. It was pretty much showed the same species and levels or numbers as we saw in the vermicompost. And then with the vermicompost tea that I made, which is getting agitated and brewed, I'm trying to get to peak populations of microorganisms. And what happened was he has a count of, it's either one or two, and I know it's one for sure, that's like the majority of, there's one species of bacteria that just like takes off where everything else kind of fizzles off and either goes away or is in very low numbers. So, you know, that bacteria is a growth promoting bacteria, which is going to be good. But if you're looking for diversity, you're losing that diversity by brewing, whereas you're keeping that diversity by having an extract.
And that goes back to the hydrolysate was the limiter. And was it a rhizobacter was the species that, or was it the Pseudomonas that came through?
It's been a while since I looked through that information. It was one of those two, and I honestly don't remember.
Yeah, no worries. But it proves a very interesting point about, you know, what your goals are when you're doing this type of work. And if your goal is purely to, you know, increase plant health, then yeah, adding the fish hydrolysate is a good tool. But again, if you're looking for diversity, which I think is probably more important, then it's a limiting factor when you start adding foods. And I know Elaine promotes like a lot of different recipes for different things. Personally, I've always been like, okay, I'm going to make my extract or my tea. And then when I go to apply it, then I'll add those food sources so that I don't limit that population or that diversity, but I still get the benefits of getting those food sources out into the field. Is that a similar practice that you do, or is it more you tend to add those foods in prior to completing the brew or the extract?
No, yeah, I do a similar practice where, so I had been brewing up until I got this information from Zach. I had been more applying compost teas when I was going out as my business to clients. I was doing more compost teas, but I would also add, so I would brew compost tea, 30 gallons. I would put that 30 gallons into 250 gallons to carry it and act as my dog is squealing. I'm about to fucking lose it on him. 30 gallons into 250 gallons. And so within that 30 gallons, I'm using a little less than half a cup per stuff of foods. But then once I'm putting it into the 250 gallons, I'm putting like a cup of fish hydrolysate into that 250 gallons and a cup of humic acid into that 250 gallons.
Gotcha.
So, yeah. Can you give me just 10 seconds so I can get a pig ear?
Go ahead. Go for it. Go for it.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Ken,
I had to run away. I got a guy here for my phone line's been down, so I've been kind of bouncing back and forth. So
was Lil operating the pop-up?
Yeah.
There?
Yeah.
Okay. I was gonna say to her, Lil, stop, but he was on a roll. I didn't want to shut him down. But
That's cool.
If
you want me to bring it back up?
Yeah, bring it back up and start with the first pie graph. And then we'll scroll down to the second one. And then lastly, that table that shows that diversity change, because I think that's important. There you go. So, I mean, it's hard to see this, but that is what I'm talking about when it comes to diversity. I mean, you literally have the vast majority of the important organisms present. Now, when he did DNA, did he have the 18S primer to do protozoa, or was this just bacteria and fungi? Or you may not even know.
This is only bacteria. I am not the best at knowing all these terms that I need to know to speak about this, but identifiers. He said that there's not enough fungal identifiers, if I'm remembering correctly, to be able to do very much fungi. So right now he's specifically focusing on bacteria.
Gotcha.
Yeah. He's hoping to start being able to do more fungi here. Our last conversation, he mentioned that. So this is only bacteria.
Gotcha. Yeah, we're working with biomakers and Mr. DNA at this point.
Yeah.
Because Mr. DNA has the 18S primer, which is the protozoa or the eukaryotes. So it's protozoa, nematodes, etc. Whereas Biomakers is more of a really high-end white glove group, but they only do bacteria and fungi. So you really need all of these tools to understand what's going on. I mean, interestingly enough, Biomakers is introducing a new product called BE Crop 3.5, which finally they're starting to look at, okay, if we're going to really understand more about plant overall health, growth, everything, we need to look at soil as both biological, and now they've moved into chemistry. And then finally, hopefully within another year or so, they'll bring in texture too, because that's always a very important thing when you're looking at soils, is what is the sand, soil, clay, organic matter relationship, as well as chemistry and biology, where Mr. DNA is just straight up pure biology. So again, in the future, as we move forward with these new methodologies, we'll start to really get into the weeds and the nitty-gritty on understanding some of these more integral, I want to say, biogeochemical actions and reactions. But so yeah, that's why I was interested in seeing that, because in better understanding it. But at the base foundation, if you have an understanding of the bacterial species with the right pipeline, and a pipeline is basically considered a filter where you run the ones and zeros or the raw data through it. And then you can determine, well, I have this percentage of this type of bacteria. That bacteria is known to do these functions in these different circumstances or within these different communities. And then you can start to weave out a more broader picture about what you can expect the results to come from an application of this type of, whether it's vermicompost or compost. So it's kind of, as crazy as the world is and as scary as the world is, it's a really great time as far as science is concerned, because finally the costs of doing these tests are getting to a point where, I don't want to use the word reasonable, but you can do it. It's not like out of the question. It's not hundreds of thousands of dollars. So I'm looking forward to doing a lot more of that work in the next year.
Yeah, that's what Zach's run into, is the cost. It's just prohibitive. So he's luckily gotten in on the university there, that he's able to get samples in when they're running other samples already. So he can just kind of slip his in the back door and get them done less expensive. So
nice.
Yeah.
Is he still actively doing this?
Yeah, I meant to mention that when you got done saying that, is if anybody wants to check out his work, it's at vermicrobiomeproject.com. So VERMI microbiome project, vermicrobiomeproject.com.
Fantastic. And I'm sure Lil can pull it up and post it when she can. Lil, can you throw that last diagram up that you had? So this was another, I believe this was the actual brew. Oh, okay. She's working on that now. There you go.
Yeah.
So I believe this was the brew, because it has a lot less diversity.
Right.
And so this was what came out of it after you did a 24 or 48 hour brew. You probably don't remember.
I've done too much since then. I think I stuck with 24 hours just for simplicity's sake. So I could, tell everyone this is exactly, 24 hours.
Got you. Which makes a lot of sense. And then scroll down a little bit more, Lil, and we'll look at the graph showing the variation between. It was still, keep going. It just had little bars, so it had the 3 different tests. There we go. That's the one. Okay, so the top one obviously is your Verma extract with incredible diversity, and then the next one, which is down slightly from that, was the Verma brew, I believe, correct?
The extract, yeah.
So we had just the straight vermicompost, the extract, which were very similar, and then lastly was the brew. There we go.
Right. Yep.
But look at that. Look at the level of diversity that was lost when you started having foods. And I think, this goes back to how important it is, especially for people that are just getting into this or want to get into this, that they need to understand that diversity is like cash. It's king. And so you really should limit your food sources during extraction or brewing. You can always add them in at the application without affecting those microorganisms. But if you don't have the diversity, and this goes back to understanding soil food web product or soil food web theory, which is that the more diverse bacteria you have, when the protozoa eat it, the more diverse pantries, cytoplasm, and everything else that is released in the rhizosphere for the plant to pull up. So again, when it comes to bacterial species, you always want to go as diverse as you possibly can. So that was just my little rant.
One thing to consider too that this data does not show, because we're only looking at bacteria here. So in a compost tea, what we're trying to do is get a bacterial boom. And with that bacterial boom, we're providing foods for their predators, which is going to be protozoa. And so we're trying to get a protozoan boom. And so what this chart doesn't show is the protozoa. And that's what I'm actually, through a brew, I'm trying to get more protozoa going, because if I were to once I make an extract, I've got some protozoa in there, usually some flagellates and a good amount of testate amoeba. But then once I start brewing it, because of the air and the water, flagellates really, all of these need moisture, but flagellates really take off more with more moisture. And so I'm getting an increase in flagellates especially, but also testate amoeba. So both of these protozoa is what I'm trying to get an increase of, so that I'm getting those out into the soil, because normally what soils are going to have a good amount of bacteria, but they're lacking the higher life forms, either their friends, fungi, or their predators, protozoa and things like that.
Exactly. And that goes to the understanding that when, especially if you add sugars in your brew to bloom the bacteria, prey predator comes in and those protozoa go nuts. And I believe the rule of thumb is that protozoa production happens from about hour 24, although some would say hour 20, through about hour 30 to hour 36. Is that in your understanding as well?
From my experience, that's what I would say. Yeah.
Yeah. And again, we're just trying to give the audience as much information as possible to prevent them from having, a bad experience, because that's always been the worst in this industry, is that word of mouth is rule, right? So if one person does a bad job, they're going to bitch and say it doesn't work for probably the rest of their life. Whereas if they have success, it's not like they're going to run around waving the flag saying, hey, look at this, look at this, look at this. So, we want to make sure that people that are trying these things out are doing it with the best rules of thumb or standard operating procedures they can have, so they don't have a bad experience, and hopefully they have a successful experience where others start to question, hey, what did you do to get those kinds of results? So thank you for clarifying those kinds of things. It's important.
Right. Yeah. And I'm always, anytime I'm talking to people about if they're wanting to make a compost tea, I'm always telling them to err on the side of not going too long. It's way better to get closer to an extract and not even brew than to go over.
Agreed. And let's face it, extracts are just so much easier to work with because you don't have to worry about that crash. So after hour 36 or 40, depending on temperature, which is a real big issue, ideally you want to be brewing at room temperature. But that's not always possible, especially in warm weather climates, and then obviously late spring, summer, and early fall is going to be very hot. So, but that being said, if you go past that threshold, what happens is the biological oxygen demand, or BOD, gets so high that the whole thing crashes. It goes anaerobic, and now you're spreading ciliates in the soil, and that's very detrimental. We don't want to do that.
Generally, what I find is that I just lose life more than going anaerobic. I just lose life, and there's just nothing there.
Yeah, very limited bacteria.
Yeah.
And people should understand though that still has viability. The problem is it's mobile. So when you apply that product, if you apply it and then add water to it after, or it rains or whatever, what's going to happen is all that cytoplasm just washes down into the lower earth and it can't be absorbed by the plants. So that's why, again, what we're talking about here is putting out a extract or a tea that can actually stick and hold through biofilm and then provide long-term benefit to the soil. I don't know about you, Troy, but I've found over the years that a lot of my clients, I get them to a certain point and then I basically wash my hands and say, hey, you're all set. You don't need me anymore. Just don't use any synthetics. And, your soil food web is up and running. Do you have a similar experience with clients?
Pretty much. I haven't had clients for more than a few years, just because of just starting a business. It's not like I had several clients who I've had on for several years, but the people who I've had the longest probably didn't need me to come anymore. Yeah.
Well, some clients like the hand holding, some to see your shiny, happy face and, tell them, oh yeah, everything looks good. I scoped it. You're fine. So I understand those clients too, but for the most part, at least in my experiences.
And yeah, I do explain that to people. I'm, my business model doesn't make sense compared to, what should be. I'm trying to get you to where you don't need me. So
yeah, I call it the anti-business model.
Yeah.
I tell them all the same thing. I'm like, look, once I get you there, the best I can hope for is that you tell your neighbor or your friends or your family, hey, use this guy and, he'll take care of you. He'll come in and get you up and running. And then he's gone. So the best we can hope for is a referral. The least we can hope for is that you were a satisfied client, but you didn't tell anybody else.
Yeah.
I've unfortunately had the experience with a lot of extremely wealthy people where they don't want to let you get successful. They want to hold you back. They don't want to tell their friends.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. So yeah, you're their secret sauce and they're not going to let it out.
Yep. Yeah. I got this guy.
Yep. I got a guy. He does this.
Yeah.
All right. So this is your buddy, I believe Zach, the Vermo.
That's Zach. Yep. Yeah.
Nice. All right. So audience, go ahead and take a screenshot of that if you want. If you're interested and you're making vermicompost, obviously, the more robust his data sets are, the more valuable his outfit can be in getting a better understanding of what these little worms do, because they're very, very powerful. Now, here's a good one for you. Have you ever seen what I want to call the necromass that exists in soil come back to life? For instance, I did a project down in Irvine where basically these are tree pits in the middle of a parking lot. Obviously, when they built the parking lot, it was all roadbed material, gravel, etc., compacted the shit out of it, paved it, and then paved around these little tree pits or cut them out after, and then dug out a little hole, threw some soil in there. And basically there was very little life whatsoever. And this particular client was looking to save water. But he had taken Elaine's course. He did understand how to use a microscope, understood the tea extract technology. He had struggled with making the compost, which a lot of people do. That's always been a challenge to make really good bio-complete compost. But needless to say, we came in and I told him, yeah, we can save you 50% water out of the gate. My gut feeling is you'll probably end up around 65 to 70% water reduction. And you'll see plant reaction in the form of healthier plants, more fruit sites, etc. Well, the one thing I did not anticipate, and I've seen this, a few times now, is that when we went back 6 months later and dug down to take soil samples to go off to the soil food web consultant, there was a shit ton of worms, like just tons, baby, big ones, cocoons and everything else. I associate that with waking up the necromass, the existing biology that was trapped in that compacted fill. Have you experienced that in your applications on any of the projects you've worked on?
Yeah. Well, it's funny because when you mentioned the question before this about the hand holding, there's a lady who had a beautiful garden and backyard, and I would go and spray her garden landscape, and her comment was to me that every time after I sprayed that she noticed the worms coming up.
Nice.
So yeah, I mean, well, especially with worms, one thing people don't realize is that worms are pretty much getting their nutrition from protozoa. And so like when people have a worm bin, they're like, oh, my worms love pumpkin. And I tell them, well, your worms love the protozoa that loves the bacteria that loves the pumpkin. And
Now
that's what's happening in the soil, is that you're increasing lower life forms, bacteria, and then the protozoa. And so by increasing their populations, then you're giving food to the worms. And so you're going to increase worm populations then as well.
Now, do the worms eat the bacteria as well as the protozoa?
Well, because of the way the worms are made, it's hard to, I use the word chew through. They don't really have mouth parts, but they're sucking in organic matter that contains bacteria and protozoa, even fungi. And then it passes through them, and through that, that material is getting inoculated with even more beneficial bacteria. So you have bacteria and protozoa going in, and then even more going out the other end, along with growth hormones and things. So
they're actually an incubator.
Yeah.
They're incubating the organisms.
Yes. Yep.
Interesting. Well, I understood that the worms are actually living off the cytoplasm of the organisms that are going through they're not a stomach, is it? Do they call it a stomach, or is it?
No, they just, they usually, every scientific book refers to a worm as a tube within a tube.
So through their tube.
Yeah.
That's too funny. So basically, from, again, my experience or understanding that the worms are actually, crushing and extracting or releasing the cytoplasm that they could absorb through their mucosis lining on the inside tube. And that only makes sense that when they're releasing or excreting, that they would be releasing also part of that cytoplasm in the form of hormones, secondary, tertiary metabolites, et cetera, et cetera. So, but I never heard anyone talk about they're actually incubators and are actually producing more, which only makes sense because if you provide all of that amniotic fluid, it would only make sense that any protozoa or bacteria present in that amniotic fluid would absorb it and divide and divide and divide. So yeah, that's really cool. That was a great fact, Troy. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
So as you moving forward now, what does your future look like?
So I just held, not me, myself and others held I told you that the NC State Vermiculture Conference is no more, and I wanted to continue to see it continue to happen because it's really a big community event. People worm nerds enjoy getting together to nerd out because they don't normally get to talk to other people who enjoy worms. So we're doing it had been the Worm Farming Conference. It's getting changed to the Worm Farmers Conference for next year. We don't have details on where it's going to be held yet, but that's going to be something that's coming up in the pipeline. So I specialize in both compost and vermicompost. And over the past several years, my life's taken me really down the vermicompost road. So I really know a lot about vermicompost and specialize in work with that. So that's what led me to do help with the vermicompost or the worm farmers conference. So I'm doing that. I do educational outreach. I'm going to be at PASA, Pennsylvania Association of Sustainable Agriculture, there in a few weeks here to present on compost tea, a class on compost tea, and then a class on cover crops and the soil biology. So how the soil food web works with cover crops and how that benefits soils to build soils. And then organic growers school in Mars Hill University. That should be a really good event. I get invited to come there for the past few years. It's a lot of good speakers. This year, I'm guessing is going to be their biggest event yet because Jesse Frost from No Till Growers is coming to speak, and Jean-Martin Fortier of the Market Gardener book is going to be there as well. So I expect a rather large attendance for that. That's coming up March. It's one of the first 2 weeks of March, but it's always a fun conference too.
And is that in Pennsylvania?
That's in Mars Hill, North Carolina. So just north of Asheville, North Carolina.
Oh, cool. Asheville's a great place.
Yeah. It's a fun conference.
I bet. Yeah, it's been a minute since I've been on the conference scene, but I totally get what you mean. It's so cool to nerd out with other people who are just as nerdy about the stuff you're talking about. 'Cause
yeah.
The rest of the population looks at you like you got 3 fucking heads.
Yeah. Well, the Worm Farmers Conference is funny because it's these people who are typically pretty antisocial and then get together and like actually talk about worms.
Yeah, I hear that one big time. So you were saying that you actually do make compost. Are you selling the compost that you make?
When I had said, I mentioned I moved a couple years ago. I had been on 10 acres and I was able to pretty much do whatever I want and make a decent amount of compost. And I've moved, I bought a house in an urban area where I barely have any land. So I'm doing urban composting with, well, I set up an ASP, but I didn't actually get the aerated part of it going. So it's just a static pile outside that I feed to my worms. And then in my basement, I've got a worm farm with different bins, and then a giant trommel out back that I screen out the worm compost. So at this point, I'm selling vermicompost or I sell compost tea brew kits, but it's nothing that I really advertise or push too much. So I might get a couple orders a month, but it's nothing big. I mainly do consulting. People are contacting me to consult or to do microscope analysis. So when people are wanting a qualitative analysis of soil microorganisms or what people refer to like a bacterial to fungal ratio, I do those types of counts.
Did you go through the consulting course, or did you're just doing what you were taught when you were there?
No, sorry, I didn't mean to laugh.
No, it's all good, dude. You went through the course before it was even made.
Yeah, so I never had to go through the course. Well, it's funny because now people pay and they get their name on Elaine's website, and like it's like, okay, I've done this for years and I don't get my name on your website.
I hear that one. I've asked a number of times. She's just, yeah.
So
get back in your
my experience with Elaine was before she ever did any online courses. So there was no reason for me to spend a bunch of money to get some title behind my name that I don't. My experience says enough about me. I don't need that title.
Exactly. I just had to ask for shits and giggles. Because I'm in the same boat. I have no letters behind my name. Although I went through an intensive 18-month training, again, I don't have a graduate certificate or anything that basically says that I did this or accomplished that. So, and again, it's at the end of the day, it's all about word of mouth and reputation. So, who needs the letters, right?
Yeah.
All right, so you are selling your vermicompost if anyone is interested. Again, it's very, very hard to get fungally dominant vermicompost. I mean, everybody's got the bacterial stuff that's basically bedded in manures, but what Troy's doing is special to or unique to the industry as a whole. So, audience, please keep that in mind if you're interested. So what kind of consultings are you doing? Are you doing farms? Are you doing gardens or ranches? What does your client base look like?
Yeah, it is farmers or composters, both small to large scale composters, people who are like wanting to start a facility or have a facility, working with them on getting better compost making. In the past year or two, there's been more and more conventional farmers who have been approaching me because of fertilizer prices, synthetic fertilizer prices. They're wanting to switch over, and they're hearing about using extract and things like that. So they're reaching out to me to learn how they can get that set up and start doing it on their farm.
Nice. I mean, that's always been the hope. I mean, when we first left Rodale, my main focus was landscapes, because I thought that, that would be the easiest and biggest way to, or have the biggest impact on the environment, because residentials, everybody has friggin' lawns, everybody has shrubs, all these residential homes are always around watersheds, and they're probably, if you fly over in a plane, you can just see the impact that they have on the overall environment. And so my goal was, okay, let's take the low hanging fruit in the landscaping industry. Well, this landscaping industry has been so programmed into this. Well, you got to use the Miracle Grow or the Scott's 3-step program, and that's how we make money. Is we fertilize the grass, so we have to cut it more, and then we fertilize it more, so we have to cut it more. So obviously not the industry that would be beneficial to change. There's too much money being made and changing hands for them to say, oh, I'm going to get rid of all of that shit, because let's face it, every product they sell the client, they get to mark up 20-25%. Whereas with compost, it's not quite that easy to do that. So I'm glad to hear that you're focusing more in the farming industry, because I think there's where, we're going to have the greatest impact on food. And if we're ever going to get our health back, we need to, approach food as medicine, and medicine that will benefit our biome, not destroy it. So that's fantastic. Now let's talk a little bit about commercial composting facilities. I've worked with a bunch of them out here, and to be honest with you, at least in my experience, the products that they're putting out are disastrous. They kill everything, right? So how have you broken into that end of it?
Well, it's typically people who have some type of medium to larger scale facility, and it's not been a ton of people that I've worked with, but that want to make a better product. They care about the product that they're making and want to do something better. So the people who I'm working with typically aren't like the big major composters like that are doing hundreds of thousands of yards a year. But I did work at one in Nashville, outside of Nashville. I have worked at a large scale facility, so I've seen the downfalls of that, and through my current job. So I also work with an organic certifier, and I see these big large scale composters. We had one recently that just lots of contamination, plastic, glass, trash. We're saving the earth. We're saving the earth, but we're sending all this shit back onto the earth and polluting it. I've gotten so many complaints about the place in Nashville about glass, lighters, plastic, you name it. And people have had it put on their field or, brought in through the compost, and it gives us a bad name. Yeah. Gives compost a bad name.
Big time. And we out here, it's called dirty murk, when they blend trash with green waste. And fortunately, for the most part out here, they're a lot more conscious about, really getting into the word out that, hey, that green bin is for greens. Do not put trash in it. And I think that the Californians as a whole are a lot more conscious of those kinds of things. Like I remember back in the company I worked with in Connecticut, who was also a soil fabrication facility. They had an amazing mine. So it was Hershey's chocolate plant was there from I think 1901 to 1980 or 90, and then they basically shut it down. So for that 90 to 100 years, they had taken all of the cocoa waste, the organic sludge, and they dumped it across the street in some adjacent land that they had owned. And then the neighbors started complaining about the smell. So they came in and put clay caps on it. And then because it was Connecticut, there was a lot of rain. So that clay would wash away and leave ruts and expose the organic matter again. So then they forced them to come in and top it with clay and then top the clay with sand so that it would irrigate without, or excuse me, it would dissipate without eroding.
Yeah.
So for 100 years they were piling this shit up, and it was, I think it was like 12 acres by over 300 feet deep. And you talk about dream come true, dude. You could see the black layer, then you'd have the clay layer, then you'd have the sand layer. So I would get Pete, their lead excavator there, to say, Pete, take a scoop of this, a scoop of that, 2 scoops of this, and 1 scoop of that. Blend those together, run them through the trommel, and then add your compost in at 20%, so I could get these mixes for my clients. That was fucking amazing. And the only problem was they had a similar situation. They had so the way they made their compost was they blew air underneath it. So they had this huge long shed that was, 50, 60 feet tall that you could run a loader in. And then they just forced air underneath it. So the air was bubbling up through the compost. And then they had a leachate collector underneath that went out to a bioreactor to dissipate the leachate. So what I found was that when I was using their compost, I would have some of those issues you were talking about. I'd get, not a lot, but enough that people would complain about it. The little pieces of plastic and other shit. So what I ended up doing was I told them, I said, okay, don't use the compost. I want you to use the biofilter. And they would laugh at me, but they were like, we need to change the biofilter. The biofilter's been there for 25 years. So we're going to actually take your advice. We're going to, start opening it up, and we'll set that stuff aside for your mixes. And then we'll add in fresh chips. And I think they had one other ingredient. Maybe it was like, it wasn't chips. Maybe it was hay or something to sop up the liquid.
Yeah, right.
As it broke down, my God, the stuff was amazing, and you had 0 contaminants in it. So that was fantastic. Now out here in Cali, they have this never-ending stream of trash trucks that dump the compacted green waste, and they do is they run it over with a loader and spread it out, and then they have an army of probably 25, 30 guys walking through with the pickers.
Yeah.
And so, again, it's not clean, but it's a lot better than perhaps some of the stuff. Like if you're seeing full lighters, that nobody's picked through that shit first.
Yeah, no, the material comes in, it gets ground up and put into a pile, no collection of contamination whatsoever. So anything that was brought in gets put into the compost. And then it gets turned. So if there was a glass bottle, the turner runs through and breaks that bottle up. And and then they screen it at the end and hope that stuff comes out with their 3/8 inch screen at the end.
Oh man, that's hardcore. So they're not adding food waste back there, are they, into their composting process?
That on that large scale was food waste. Yeah.
So they did have food waste in.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
So the interesting thing out here was they tried to take what we call GOM, ground up organic matter. So the grinders I'm talking about, the giant conveyor belt.
Yeah.
Nonstop dumping and just grinding, right? So we call that GOM, ground up organic matter. Super hot, hyperthermophilic. There is no separation of greens and browns. It's just whatever the claw put in there comes out.
Yeah.
So very, very highly unstable. As a matter of fact, the facility out here, Agerman, that I worked with, started to get pretty deep into trying to figure out how to arrest the thermophilic process so that they could take this GOM and actually inoculate it and make a bio-intensive compost out of it. And so I started working with the yard manager, and on this one particular day, he was taking me out back to the oldest compost he had, because that's what I wanted to look at. And he told me that compost had been there for about 20 years, or not 20, 10 years.
Yeah.
And it was an enormous pile. And so he drove me out back there, and we're looking at it, and he's like, "Oh shit." I'm like, "What's the matter?" He goes, do you have your thermometer with me? I'm like, "Yeah, of course. That goes with me wherever I go." So we jack it into this pile, and the fucking shit's at like 185. I'm like, "Dude, this is going to go fucking off."
Yeah.
I go, "This is 10 years old." And he goes, "Oh, fuck, I totally forgot about this." I'm like, what? He goes, "They were doing a movie shoot out here, and they made us push all the, we had these windrows. They pushed all the windrows into one giant pile, and I forgot about it." So he runs back to the truck. He gets on the fucking radiator. He goes, "Okay, all hands on deck. I need every loader from that facility out here right now, breaking this down into fucking windrows before it ignites." And I'm like, "Oh my God." So here it is, 10 years old GOM. All you got to do is stack it back up and it goes off again.
Jeez.
Right. So how do you even deal with that shit? That's where I started with, like, all right, this is going to be a lot harder of a project than I anticipated. So I started going, all right, I'm going to play with chemistry, because obviously I can't add more carbon. It's just not, no matter how much fucking carbon I add, it's not going to be enough. And I don't have a clean source of carbon because everything is gone. There is no like browns pile and greens pile. It's just all. So I started playing around with quicklime, spent lenadite fines, some different rock dusts, and I blended the GOM with these materials, and I ended up finding a formula to arrest the thermophilic process. The only problem was that in dealing with these powders, it was difficult to blend them evenly.
Yeah.
Like, dude, I built this little like conveyor belt with another conveyor belt, so the powders came on and dumped on the conveyor belt that had the GOM, and then that went up and then piled itself on top of itself, and it worked pretty good. But the only problem was when the wind blew, I ended up looking like a fucking Smurf. I mean, just covered with fucking stone dust and fucking quicklime.
Okay, yeah. I gotta jump on and laugh at that one, Mr. Smurf. Yeah.
The white Smurf, man. Those guys laughed at me like a fucking crazy man. But it worked. So the concept is that there is a way to do this. The only problem is that the powers in B generally only look at this stuff as, a waste product, like they're diversion. Get rid of it. They don't care about like how to make it more beneficial, because let's face it, in those circumstances, and I'm sure you had the same one, is these guys water the fuck out of that GOM. And so what happens is the center core is thermophilic. So the water just runs down the outside edge and then soaks in on the bottom. And the whole place smells like ammonia the whole time. And then when they turn it and they hit that anaerobic layer, it's just like, oh, the fucking methane, the smell is just fucking brutal. So all of that is gassed off. All that nitrogen is gassed off in a volatile organic compound instead of being stored in the actual matrix itself. So I just wanted to share that with you, because if you do find a medium scale composter that is interested in trying to prevent that that VOC from happening, this is a way to do it. And I don't know about you, but how many times I was told you can't add lime to compost, you're going to fuck it up. Has anyone ever told you that?
Not in that way, but yeah, I mean, I've heard plenty of people say they shouldn't add lime to compost, but I don't necessarily agree. I mean, I'm not saying I add it, but I don't have an issue with it.
Yeah. So I was told repeatedly by a bunch of different people, whatever you do, don't add lime to compost. You're gonna turn the whole thing anaerobic. Well, I had the exact opposite effect, and this goes back to when we were kids. Well, I'm a lot older than you are, but back when I was a kid, camping sites, you had an outhouse, right? And so you went in the outhouse in the morning, you did your business,
right?
But you always a can of lime, and
sprinkle it.
Yeah, scoop some lime and sprinkle it over the top to eradicate the odor. And so that went back to my mind when I was trying to deal with this. And I was like, holy fuck, that will get rid of the odor. So that means I'm not volatilizing those organic compounds, because that's what the odor is the volatilization process of those compounds. And so that's a little trick that I wanted to share with you, and hopefully you can take advantage of it. The spent lenadite chips work extremely well in creating texture. The rock dust was obviously added minerals and nutrients to the compost, so that as the bacteria went from thermophilic to mesophilic, which basically happened in the introduction, now they could start mining those minerals and those nutrients. And I basically turned GOM, which was a 0.0103, into a I think it was a 3.543 organic fertilizer. Dude, I made an organic fertilizer out of GOM.
Yeah.
And the only problem that the company had was the bulk density. They're like, oh, that won't work for us. I'm like, what do you mean? I just turned your shit into a fucking organic fertilizer. I just spun fucking gold from your lead. What do you mean that doesn't work? And they're like,
oh, well, too heavy or what?
Well, yeah. He said that, now we're going to roll up with one of our 18 wheelers, and the truck's only going to be 3/4 full instead of full. And the farmer's going to complain because he thinks we're ripping him off. And I'm like, you have absolutely the wrong attitude toward this. When those farmers put this on their orchards and they see their trees explode with growth, they're going to want more of it. They're not going to complain that they got less. They're going to be like, damn, you're charging me the same amount of money for something that's 10 times better than what you were selling me.
Yeah.
The corporate dogma is just beyond me. I mean, hello, lead to fucking gold, and you don't want it. You think that that's a waste of time. So anyway, I know that trick will be in good hands with you behind it. The formulation, again, it'll depend on the GOM that you're playing with as to how much of each of these to use. But it does an amazing job of arresting the thermophilic process and moving it right into the fucking mesophilic. It'll hover around, depending on your recipe, hover around 85 to 110, and you'll just see explosive fucking protozoan growth.
Cool.
Yeah. So I figured I'd share that.
I like the analogy with the outhouse, because I know that trick too, and I never could have put that together. That's a good idea.
Yeah, my pleasure, dude. That's what I'm here for. Green to gold, you got it, brother. All right, so what else have you been working on, my friend? You doing any research or?
I had gone to Jamaica. I told you about my Jamaica trip.
No, what were you doing in Jamaica?
I got chosen by, I was recommended by someone else, and then ended up getting chosen by USAID to participate. There's a thing through the U.S. Farm Bill called the Farmer to Farmer program, and they work with Partners of the Americas, who works with third world countries. And so through these things, and then a thing called Food for the Poor in Jamaica, I went to Jamaica in September 2022, just a little over a year ago. I went down to work with groups of farmers. It was the year of the Ukraine conflict. And so because of petroleum prices affected synthetic fertilizers, and they were having a hard time affording that. So they wanted someone to come down and work with them on a organic or natural approach to agriculture. So I met with different groups of farmers then to teach them a biological approach and making compost. Because, I mean, you're surrounded by jungle. You've got all this organic matter, green, brown. It's like, take advantage of it.
Right.
So yeah, I worked with them on that, and then I went back. So that I went for 2 weeks, and then I went back for 3 weeks in November to. This was more of a composting trip. I went to the Grand Bahia Principe, which is the largest luxury resort in Jamaica, and they have been working towards going zero waste. So they recycle all their paper, recycle all their computer products. All their waste is obviously going somewhere, but the food was the last challenge for them. So they needed someone to help them figure out. They send a lot of their food scraps to local hog farmers, which is great, but they've got eggshells, coffee grounds, and callaloo, which pigs can't digest or can't eat. So they've got different things on site that they needed to turn into fertility or, deal with as a waste product. And then they've got a lot of landscaping. They have an on-site landscape crew. This is a huge place. So they've got an on-site landscape crew of, gosh, I don't know how many people. So they've got all this landscape debris plus the food scraps. So you've got your browns, you've got your greens, and we just had to figure out a system to work with on site. So I got them set up with starting off with windrows and then moving into an ASP, an aerated static system. And I'm hoping that they're still working with that. I had checked with on them, and their skid steer was down like a month or two after I had worked with them, and they were trying to get things going. But so I worked with them, and then another couple resorts just to teach them about composting, and then work with more groups of farmers as well.
Nice, dude. That's great. That's solid work, man. I wish I see these facilities, these HOAs and resort type operations that would so benefit from these types of approaches, because right now the members or the residents, depending on which type you're talking about, are paying to haul all this shit away, whereas there's no reason they can't chip it and reuse it or compost it and apply it. At one point, I actually started working with Merck, but the devil himself, Merck Pharmaceuticals, and they brought me in because they bought a rocket composter. I don't know if you've heard of those. Yeah. This thing's a piece of shit.
In vessel.
Just a total piece of shit. And I'm like, all right, you make an anaerobic sludge. What are you going to do with that shit, right?
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, we're going to spread it everywhere. I'm like, no, don't spread that everywhere, because everyone's going to complain about the fucking odor.
Yeah.
You have to take that and compost it. Or let it sit until it starts to become aerobic. But for the most part, all you did was make humate, and you wasted all of that nitrogen and any of the other elements that can volatilize. So what did you really accomplish, and how much did you spend? And there was this whole the room that was built and all this soil food web propaganda on the walls, and I'm like, you're not following soil food web. What? Dude, you're doing anaerobic digestion.
Yeah.
But it was so close, dude. We almost got the budget to come in there and flip it on its head, and they were going to move it to. They were going to start up another one on another Merck campus right down the road, and it would have been just like I'm talking about, the dream fucking job, because their campuses are fucking huge. They've got all these contaminant sites. I walk around these giant campuses, and I'd be like, hey, why is that soil all bare over there? Why don't you at least cover crop it? And they're like, oh, no, we can't go over there. It's contaminated. I'm like, what? They're like, oh, yeah, we're that's all fenced off. We're not allowed to go over there. I'm like, well, that your compost over there would begin to clean up those.
Right. Yeah. Plants would clean it and compost.
Right. Would fix it. So all the more reason that you should be friggin' putting all your money behind this process or this new program, because not only would you make your whole site greener, you'd save a tremendous amount of water, you'd save a lot of hauling expenses, and you'd be cleaning up your fucking messes. You'd be wiping your damn asses. And then, unfortunately, I believe it was a new CEO came in, got rid of the program, fired my buddy who had been, basically getting this program off the ground for the last 5 years.
Right.
And so it was just a heartbreaking story, dude. Just a fucking heartbreaker. We were so fucking close to getting that off the ground. Yeah, they had problems with like bees, like, they had like whole like kindergarten and daycare and all this other stuff, and they weren't allowed to spray synthetics on that because the employees rose up and said, no, we don't want our kids exposed to that shit. And so that was another reason they needed this like this organic approach to land care. But unfortunately, again, it all went to hell in a handbasket, which was horribly sad.
They were doing their food scraps, or what were they composting with the rocket composter?
All of the cafeteria stuff.
Okay.
So
okay.
I think there was 3 or 4 cafeterias on site. So every 3 or 4 buildings would have one cafeteria that all the employees went to. But I mean, you talk about waste so much, because a lot of it was buffet style. So you know what happens at the end of the buffet at 2 o'clock?
Yeah.
Scrape it out, throw it in a friggin' trash can, and then off to the rocket it went.
Right.
But I don't know. Again, there's just so many opportunities for change in a positive direction when you talk about green waste, landscaping residues, and food waste. But unfortunately, the corporate mentality just isn't there to give 2 flying fucks about the environment.
Exactly. Yes.
So typically around now at the hour and a half point, we pull up questions. Now, strangely enough, there's only one question, which I'm kind of surprised about, but that's all right. So why don't we go ahead and bring up that question? Again, when you have a minute, there you go.
Should you add sand to help worms digest or ingest? Yeah. So when you're starting a worm bin, it's good to add a little bit of grit. I've noticed that people who do, how should I explain this? Beginning worm farmers can tend to go a little bit overboard on this, and worms don't really need a ton of grit. Like if I've got a bin that's, a couple feet deep, like there's only once or twice that I'm sprinkling just a tiny little bit of sand in there, like right at the beginning, just to give them something to digest with. And then, maybe halfway through, but it's not like something that you have to add nonstop. And sand works great. A lot of people are trying to pay for something or find something that they can. What I'm trying to say is there's no reason to have to pay for anything. Like go get some sand, like the tiniest little bits of sand, and sprinkle that in your bin.
Great advice. I try to get people to wildcraft whenever possible. I mean, there's all these resources all around us.
Right.
And especially like, in the colder climates, come spring, all that sand they used on the roads has been, basically washed free of salts and additives and everything else, and piles up in the catch basins, right? So if you go to where the catch basin dumps out into the stream or the river or the watershed, there's endless fucking supplies of sand.
Yeah.
And that brings up another good question. Have you ever played with rock dusts?
I'll add some rock dusts into like my vermicompost, but it's nothing that I've like really researched or, like looked at the biology and then like added some and seen what it does to the biology or anything like that.
So there's a gentleman out here who's a pretty well-known vermicomposter. He has like these fruit bins that he composts in. So they're like, they're 4x4 or like 40 inches by 40 inches, whatever.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, you could pick them up with a fork truck and move them around. And he's had tremendous success with those because basically when you water them, any excess water in the form of a leachate will just fall out the bottom. Where in windrows, like the place that I'm working at now, Peach Hill, the windrow, the bottom, 4-6 inches is just fucking anaerobic soup because there's just not enough place for that to go.
Right.
And he adds like, I don't know, probably 10 different rock dusts. And when you look at his worm castings, he's not fungally dominant, but man, he is a fertilizer. Like the level, the chemistry level on that stuff is amazing. And I don't understand whether the worms are actually, using that grit and grinding it together and making it even smaller. Again, increasing the surface area so that the bacteria can take hold and build their biofilm and start digesting it, or what. But when you look at his chemistry reports, he's totally an organic fertilizer, like off the charts.
Right. Yeah,
So
and I as far as like adding something like that in, I'd be more likely to add it in after it was fed to the worms, but I don't think it's going to make that big of a difference.
Gotcha. Well, again, I've been bugging him to come on this podcast for 2 years now. Or, well, I tried to get him on the other podcast I did, but he's a shy guy. He's like, no, I don't do this. So again, I was happy when we connected because I'm like, damn, now I got one vermicompost guy, and I have another one, Chandler from Wormies. Yeah, you know Chandler?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Chandler's a great guy. I was actually.
Oh yeah, you went through there.
Yeah. I did an impromptu soil awareness day there, and it was crazy because like I literally didn't know until 24 hours before I was going to be there that I was going to be there, because it was like all these different people I'd stop and see. Sometimes it would take a couple more days than I expected, or sometimes that person wasn't available, and so I had to keep moving on. But I hit him up and said, "Hey, dude, I'm going to be in Michigan on tomorrow at such and such a time. If there's anybody that wants me to whip out my microscope and check your soil, let them know." And he goes, "Cool, yeah, I was going to ask you if I could invite some friends." So I got there, and by the end of the day, there must have been 20, 25 fucking people. And they were asking really good questions, man. Like really good. Like in the years prior to COVID, when I did, whether it was the conference or the soil awareness classes, impromptu shit, I might get 5-6 people, nothing big. And the questions were, it was more me monologuing the understanding of it than there was a, question and answer session. But yeah, Chandler's, man, definitely some like really knowledgeable people that really were happy and interested in learning more about the deeper understanding of all of this. And so I'm glad that you know it. Do you guys connect on Instagram or by email?
Luis had his partner at Wormies had been to the NC State Vermiculture Conference. I don't think Luis spoke, but we met there and had a conversation, and I've kept in contact with Luis. And then through our relationship on Instagram, I chat with Chandler different times. We used to chat a good amount more. I haven't in a while, but
he got really busy when he moved into that new facility. So, he was scrambling like a madman when I was there.
Yeah.
But a really badass facility. I mean, he has plenty of room to expand now.
I want to see it. I'd love to see it firsthand. Yeah.
So unfortunately, I'm not doing a lot of traveling anymore. I as much as I loved that trip across the country, dude, I was a fucking mess for like 3 or 4 weeks after. I just had no idea. Like I must have just been living on adrenaline the whole time, going from place to place to place to place. Because when I got back here, I just crashed, and I was just exhausted. I was tired mentally. So that was a big burden. So I've been thinking twice about, kind of trying to do that, that road trip again. And I know Casey and Keisha, do you know those two? I think it's
Catalyst bioamendments.
Yeah, Catalyst bioamendments. They went out and did a road trip last summer and had a similar result. They met all kinds of people and again, asking really good questions.
Yeah, yeah. You guys don't have kids.
Well, mine are all grown, unfortunately. Fortunately, depending on which way you look at it. But yeah, they don't have kids.
You have puppies, Leighton. You're in worse shape now than you were then.
Oh yeah, good point, right? Troy, do you have a puppy? Is that Squeaky in the background you? Because it's not me.
It's my dog. Yeah, I was about to go throw a blanket over him because he's driving me nuts.
How old is he?
He's a little over a year.
Oh, he's still a puppy.
Yeah, yeah.
I
hate yippy dogs, and I got a yippy dog.
Well, come on, up, come on, up. This was Pauline's emotional support dog.
Cool.
I was sworn not going to have a pet because I traveled too much. I just didn't want to be, cruel to him. And she convinced me that she needed this little pup to get through her battles, and I agreed. And so we ended up adopting Poe. And then recently, Poe had kind of been going through like depression, and I think it was the time of year his mother passed 2 years ago in December, and so he was like, moping around. It was so bad I had to call him for breakfast. And this fucking lives for food, and all he would do was go back in the bedroom, where she used to be, and just lay on the floor. So yeah, it was really sad, and it was breaking my heart. So I talked to the trainer about, like, I was like, hey, can I get a cat? Just something to be around him. And I don't
companion animal for your companion animal.
So the only reason
my dog real quick because he's
go ahead. Yeah, bring him in. Bring him on, man. This is a dog-friendly show.
Come here.
Have him hop up on your lap. There you go.
He's a
cutie. Cute.
Yeah, I would get Cheeto out now, but he's gonna run around the house like a maniac and just probably knock over the camera and everything else. So unfortunately, he's in his crate till after the show, and then I'll take him and pull on a nice walk. But yeah, originally I was just gonna get a cat because they're so easy, right? Like, I had an outdoor cat when I was a kid, and you just leave the door open and leave some food in a bowl, and you're done, right? And she's like, well, cats tend to be nocturnal, and so he's going to be up all night and sleeping all day, and Poe's going to be up all day and sleeping all night. So I don't see that really being advantageous. And I was like,
right,
because I really didn't want to get another dog, and so we kicked it around, and then he wasn't getting any better. I've mixed up his foods. I tried changing the walk schedule, but just to no avail. And so finally, she sent me a picture from a shelter out here called Lang Foundation. So the Lang Foundation basically goes into these kill shelters, and when the dog hits the kill level, they're up next for the fucking electric chair.
Yeah,
Lang goes in there and scoops them up and brings them back with the understanding that even if nobody ever adopts this dog, the dog is property of the Lang Foundation. They do a lot of outreach, and they have tons of volunteers coming in, walking the dogs and patting them and grooming. And they do cats too. And so she sent me a picture of Cheeto, was his name. And he's a little ankle biter. He's 10 pounds at best. He's a mutt. I think she said he's pug, Chihuahua, and Beagle or something crazy.
Yeah.
So I went down originally with the intention just to introduce Poe to another puppy. Like, we introduced him to one puppy and he was fine, because that was the other concern, being that he's a shepherd and very much a one-person dog. There was kind of concerns that he might be too aggressive with anything new in the house, especially after losing his mom. So we introduced Poe to this little puppy named Bennett, and he did fine. There was no nipping or biting, and he played nice with him, so that was cool. So we went down to try it again, in a different setting with basically a shelter dog, which are much different than regular dogs.
Yeah, yeah.
And they live in a cage, right? They grow up in a cage. They have no childhood. They don't get social interaction and all that. So it's a big difference. And so we introduced Poe to Cheeto, and they got along great. And I spent probably 2 hours down there, and they're like, so what do you think? You want to take him? And I'm like, oh man, kind of like Cheeto and Poe seem to get along great, but I'm just not sure about the commitment. And Robin was like, don't worry, I'll support you. I'll make sure you're all right. You'll get through the process. And so I left with Cheeto, irresponsible. I went through about 3 weeks of absolute fucking mayhem. My routine was destroyed. My habits were ruined. Everything was flipped upside down, which is probably a good thing for the New Year's, right?
Yeah.
Break
Flip
your old habits.
Yeah.
And anyway, the moral of the story is these two get along great. And Poe is back to being a puppy, and he's playful, and he can't wait for his little brother to get up so he can go play with him. Ken, did you have something you wanted to add, brother?
Well, we've got a couple of questions, actually.
Oh,
Yeah,
all right.
through.
When feeding your worms, which list is longer, what they can eat or what they can't eat?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's definitely the list is longer of what they can eat, as in no T, CAN, can eat. I honestly can't think of anything that you wouldn't want to feed to worms. People say onions and citrus you shouldn't give to worms. It's not that big of a deal. So citrus contains, I always get it mixed up. I think it's called citrulline. There's some type of acid in citrus that can harm a worm's skin, but it's only like when that orange peel is like super fresh, like after a few days, that stuff's going to be broken down. So it's not going to be harmful to a worm. Plus they can stay away from it. So yeah, gosh, I'm trying to think of anything that you cannot feed a worm. And
What about eggshells?
well, yeah, eggshells, they're not going to break down. People say not dairy and not meat. And really the only reason that you don't want to do those is for rodents and cats and things like that are going to get into your worm bin. They're going to break down. Anything that's organic, you could throw a human dead body in there and they'll break it down. So anything that's organic, they're going to break it down.
Okay,
so there's a good way to get rid of your bodies.
Yeah.
Just takes a while. Yeah.
Shallow grave and a whole bunch of worms.
Yes.
So we had another one. I've been told I can't put my junk mail, or I can put my junk mail in the worm farm. I haven't, just don't think it would be healthy with all the inks, etc.
Yeah. So with junk mail, if it is shiny paper, I won't use it. But if it's just regular white paper, I'll use it. And even with envelopes, like not that I do this with every single one because I don't have time, but if I'm trying to put it through my paper shredder, I'll pull out the little plastic window. Mm-hmm. Other than that, like plain white paper, I'm not concerned with the inks. Although like receipt paper, I don't compost receipt paper because it has
the thermophilic stuff.
Yeah. I can't think of it's the PCBs.
Yeah. It's what's in the toner that's the problem.
Yeah.
That reacts to the heat. And that's another good thing. Another good point to understand is that all the inks nowadays are made from soy base. So they're not like the old days when they were, grinding toxic shit to make the inks. But I agree with you 100%. Anything shiny, absolutely not going to work. But anything that's plain and has color, it shouldn't be an issue. And what you said you shred it first?
Yeah, I put it through the shredder.
That's good advice. Fluff it up.
Yep.
Now, what about moisture content? Is there a rule of thumb that you like to maintain moisture, like the squeeze test or?
Yeah, I was just going to mention that there was a question that came up. I did see your question. I'll answer Leighton's first here. So Well, we're talking about worms and we're talking about compost. So with regular compost, I'm wanting that at like 50 to 60% moisture, whereas a worm farm, that can also depend, but usually for vermicompost, you want to keep that around 70 to 80% moisture. So heavier on the moisture, because the more moisture you have, the more microorganisms you're going to have. And so then the more microorganisms you have, then you're going to have a healthier worm population as well. The problem comes into play is that people are wanting to screen out vermicompost or regular compost, and then you've got that moisture in there. And then for breeding worms, it's even more than that. You want like almost 90% soupy. They really like a lot of water for breeding environments.
Well, how the hell do you keep that from going anaerobic? Do you have a lot of like structure to it, or?
It's right at the point. I don't really breed worms, but yeah, it's really a fine line between going anaerobic and it's just, it would be like where you would squeeze it, and right as you start to squeeze it, it start to have water come out. But other than that, you don't have like standing water.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So there would be a lot about the bedding. The bedding would be critical in that.
Right. Yeah. The material for bedding. Yep.
Yeah, because I talk a lot about structure and compost. Like basically the compost I'm making now are all diverted waste streams. So like one of them is cocoa core plugs from an organic lettuce factory in LA, spent mushroom substrate from Smallhold in LA. And then there's this kiln dried lumber they recycle, and they take the kiln dried lumber, grind it, and make this mulch that they then dye in green, black, red, and brown for different clients. But they get rid of all the fines. And those fines are fucking amazing fungal food. Because they're kiln dried, they act like little sponges when they get in water. They just soak it up.
Right.
And they provide that structure because they don't compress real easy. Whereas the spent mushroom substrate, that shit compacts like fucking nobody's business. Like it could be bone dry and it's totally anaerobic. Stinks like hell. The core plugs work really great. The core fines, because they like to screen it, and then they sell the core fines to blend into their soil mixes as a source of potassium. That works great for their end, but I don't want the fines. I want the coarse shit. Then there's GOM, and there's GOM, coarse, 1 inch minus, and 3/8 minus. So the 3/8 minus stuff sucks because it's just too fine. Whereas the 1 inch minus is a little bit too heavy. So I usually get it's 1.5 inches, 3/4, 3/8. So I get the 3/4, which is coarse enough to provide structure so that the compost won't collapse. But then as soon as I get that just a little bit out of whack, now I can't fucking get the water to hold in it. So it's tricky to get the appropriate structure, but have enough of the fines and the other materials that hold that moisture. And, just trying to maintain 50, 60 out here in California is a bitch because you've got the dry, the winds, and the high UVs. It's been a big learning curve, dude. Back east, oh man, I could knock it out of the park every compost pile I made. Out here, it took me probably 3 months to play with all these different ingredients. First of all, to figure out which ones I wanted to use, and then second, on which ratios. And then once I got that formulated, then it was like, okay, windrow, no, that doesn't work. I started making brownies, so it was only 2 feet deep but wide and a flat top so that it would hold the moisture. That worked great, but the only problem is the top 4 to 6 inches would dry out. And so I'd only get this maybe 12-inch layer of really good shit, because obviously the bottom would again go anaerobic, the top would go hydrophobic. So I would lose almost 50% of everything I made to the elements. So yeah, it's definitely a lot more of a challenge out here than back east for sure. And it looks like there's a couple more questions here. There you go.
Yeah. How deep should you keep your bedding on top?
I'm guessing this means for a worm bin.
Yep.
It's gonna be dependent upon the management style of bed that you have, but for most people who are doing like a small bin system, really just anywhere from 1 to 3 inches. If you're doing a worm bin, it's generally best to add small layers of food and bedding at once in like 1/2 inch to 1 inch layers. So come in and feed a layer that's about that big. Let your worms break it down over 3 or 4 days, and then come back and feed them some more.
So lasagna style. So layer of food, layer of bedding.
If you're doing it that way, yeah. I mean, I'm feeding pre-compost, so I'm just dumping in a layer of bedding. But yeah, if you're putting in both greens and browns, you could do like kind of mix it up a bit and then put that layer in there. Yeah.
Got you. Because you're pre-digesting your food into your compost, into your bedding is your food source.
Correct. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Or even in people don't always understand that when you're feeding a worm bin, you're feeding browns and greens, but no matter what it is, it's all food for worms.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's best to feed in small amounts so then that you're keeping it aerobic. What happens is if people put like, especially not pre-composted or not, things that haven't started to break down, you put 1 inch or 2 layer thick of this gross stuff, and then it's just going to sit there and turn anaerobic. And then if people don't pay attention and they're like, oh, well, my book said that I'm supposed to feed this once a week, and then they pile more in there and it hasn't gotten broken down. So that's the other number one rule with worm composting is whenever you feed your worms, make sure that you give them time to break it down before you give them more food, because otherwise you're just going to get a buildup and it's going to turn nasty. And you can tell that they've broken things down or they've chewed through it by what's called the pool table effect. So if you're dropping things in your bin that's chunky like that, you've got this chunky layer, and then once the worms work through it, you've got this nice, what looks like a felt pool table that's even across the top, and it's just nice fine material.
So that's when it's ready to feed again.
Yep. Yeah, you would want to wait till you're closer to where you've got fine material. Otherwise, if you still got those chunks in there and then you're throwing more chunks on top, you're going to get these nasty wet pockets of anaerobicity that it may not all turn anaerobic, but you're going to definitely have some pockets where like an avocado, you didn't eat the whole avocado and you throw that in there, and then you've got this big wad of nasty avocado mess that doesn't get broken down, and then you throw other stuff on top of there and it's still wet. So you get that anaerobic pocket where, as if you let the worms break it down, they're chewing through the material, spreading it out, and creating an aerated environment.
Good advice. Really good advice. I never heard of the pool table effect.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've never heard of that one either. So we've got another question here. I grind my eggshells to powder for worms. Would that work better than, or is that more of a grit?
Yeah, that's great. You can turn it into a powder, or it doesn't really matter. The more you can break it down, the faster it's going to not be an eggshell. So if you turn it into a powder, here's the deal. If you turn it into a powder, like a flour powder, it's not necessarily going to act as a grit for the worms, but you're going to be adding all that calcium from the eggshell, so it's going to be of benefit. Whereas if you don't break it down quite as much into a powder and leave it a little bit bigger in size, particle size, that's going to be more of a grit for your worms. But they're going to generally have enough grit in there from other things anyway, so it's not something to be like too concerned about.
Hey, I wonder if they cook them first. Cake in the cup. Do you cook them? Do you brown them first so that you powderize them? Maybe he'll answer.
We'll have to wait and see.
No, it isn't cake and cup. I don't remember who that question was from, but anyway.
So a friend had just posted the other day, they were posting about eggshells and how they rinse them off, and how their partner that lives with them gets mad that they rinse them off because it's nasty eggshell material. And I was like, don't even rinse them off. Just let them dry out, because that stuff that's in there is albumin. Yeah, that's how you pronounce it. Which is made for a chicken. It's full of vitamins and minerals that was for a tiny little baby chick. So let that stuff dry on your eggshells, and you got it. Not like it's like, it's jam packed. It's not like it's a ton, but that's vitamins, minerals, nutrients that are in that egg, that if you let that dry on there and then grind it up, you got that much more nutrients and minerals for your worms and plants.
That's a great idea. And the reason I asked about cooking is because of natural farming. So in natural farming, you make a WCS by cooking the eggs, but they talk about peeling off that white film that you're talking.
Yeah.
But personally, I was like, why would you do that? It's still going to be beneficial. But maybe it's because of when you grind or when you put it in the vinegar, it doesn't react the right way because of that whitish coating. But anyway.
That's exactly it, Leighton. You want that organic out of there, so when you're putting it in the vinegar and you're getting your reaction, it's not interfering.
Gotcha. So different methodologies for different tricks for different, or different tips for different tricks, right?
Yeah. Different strokes for different folks.
There you go, bro. There you go.
So,
all right. Yep.
We got a couple more that's come in. So can you feed plants to worms like nettles to increase nitrogen in the castings?
Yeah, I was going to say, like, when you're feeding plants, you're providing nutrients and everything from the plant. So it's not like you're necessarily going to be providing that much more nitrogen by providing a higher nitrogen plant, if that makes sense.
What about the stingers? If it's stinging nettle, would it affect the worm?
You mean like the stinger itself?
Yeah, you know how stinging nettle, like if you pick it,
right.
Rash, would that rash hurt the worms?
I don't think that. I think it would be kind of the same thing as with like citrus and onions, where if it were a potentially harmful thing, that the worm's going to avoid it until it breaks down.
Got you.
And one last question. Any opinion on using worm leachate?
I have a very strong opinion on using worm leachate. Worm leachate is not tea. So there's a couple of different things regarding worm leachate. For one thing, worm leachate is water that has passed through the material, and it could be sitting there for you don't know how long. So it could be anaerobic. It couldn't be. It could maybe not be anaerobic. You don't know. So it's a questionable material. So it could be anaerobic. It couldn't be anaerobic. And so therefore you shouldn't use it because you don't know. So you should treat it as a manure. The other thing I like to point out to people is that think of how many greens in the past several years, think of how many recalls of salmonella and things like that for leafy greens and things like that, right? So you're feeding your worm bin, you've got spinach that you take out and whatever other leafy greens, and you put these into your worm bins. So let's say they just happen to have some salmonella on them, and you put your spinach leaf in there, and then you mist it on the top to give your worm some water. So you mist that salmonella. The salmonella travels down through the worm bin, goes into the leachate. You collect that leachate, and you're like, oh, I've got this great stuff that I'm going to spray on my food. So then you take that salmonella and you spray it all over your food. Not a good thing. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's not always a bad thing, but you don't ever know. And and so you can't treat it like a compost tea. It is a leachate and should just be tossed. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to kill plants, but it can. I've spoken on this subject, and I had a guy come up to me afterwards who said, you know what? I took leachate and I put it on my wife's flowers, and I killed 3 of the 4 flowers, and I wondered what happened. And now I realize what happened. So that's what happened. Yeah.
Yeah. And that brings up a very valid point that Brian, the vermicompost maker out here, told me about, was that he's had issues where he likes to use horse manure, but it has to be composted.
Yeah.
So in this one particular case, the guy that was loading his truck was turning or stacking up fresh horse manure and shavings. And he rolled in and said that he needed a load of the compost. So the guy just went over and scooped a load of the compost, put it in his truck. And then he had a huge E. coli outbreak that took him
Raw manure, yeah.
months to combat, because you're creating an environment that's ideal for pathogens to grow. So by adding salmonella, yeah, I could see how salmonella would just explode in growth, especially in the leachate, which is the perfect
Right.
anaerobic environment for it to thrive in.
Right.
Remember, anaerobes like, lack of oxygen, and all pathogens are anaerobic for the most part. Some of the new engineered shit
Yeah.
won't go there. Can live in aerobic environments, but anyway. Well, we're at the top of the hour. We're clean on questions, I believe.
We are.
Awesome. Well, listen, Troy, thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for giving us 2 hours of your time. It was great to see you again. Have a couple chuckles about the Rodale days.
Yeah, totally. I appreciate you asking me.
No, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Ken, as always, rather big ups for all the time and energy you put in behind the scenes to make this actually happen. And I don't know if there's some laundry list or house cleaning that you would like to do before we.
Just that we've got the show on Thursday to let people know, with it being almost minus 40 here, I haven't been doing any shows in the R&D grow. That'll come back when things warm up a little bit. The girls are just starting to shoot pistols. So it's like watching grass grow.
Better than paint drying.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, guys, with that, we'll peace out, everybody, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thanks, everybody. See you, Ken. See you, Leighton.